Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. They humiliated her on the plane, not knowing that her husband was the owner. Camille Anderson calmly adjusted her ivory silk scarf as she boarded the flight Monroe Air 747, towards New York JFK. The air was already heavy with heat, even at this early hour. It was 8 a.m. in Dakar, and on the tarmac vibrating under the sun, the elegant white and blue aircraft stood, ready for the Atlantic crossing. Camille climbed the footbridge with a confident step, her shoulders straight despite her fatigue. She had passed 3 weeks to supervise a humanitarian mission in remote villages of Senegal, where access to clean water and basic healthcare was a miracle. She had cared for, trained, and listened. And now she was returning home, her heart full, but her body exhausted. She aspired to nothing but a peaceful flight, a hot cup of tea, maybe a soothing movie, and a few hours of silence, away from the hustle and bustle of the world. She was alone, as often happens in his travels. Camille was public health physician, graduated from Harvard, a former consultant for the WHO, but her career shone first and foremost through her humanity. Her modest appearance contrasted with the power of her curriculum. She knew about lectures under crystal chandeliers as well as sleepless nights on wooden benches, dressing wounds under oil lamps. She wore a simple beige suit, well cut but not ostentatious. Her worn leather bag contained more books and notebooks than luxuries. No flashy jewelry, no makeup, just that quiet grace that comes from those who know who they are. More health, dark skin, his assumed African features, sun elegant silence, all of this did not fit, in the eyes of some, with the usual image they had of first-class passengers. Sun ticket en main, she spotted her place, 1A, first row, window seat. She greeted a passing flight attendant politely and settled in. The soft leather of her seat, still cool from the air conditioning, contrasted with the humid heat of the airport. She placed her bag at her feet, fastened her seatbelt, then took out a horny book from his bag, a Senegalese novel that a local nurse had recommended to him. She had barely turned the first page when she felt the looks. First one. Then two. Then a breath. To her right, a white man, wearing a suit too tight for the heat, was staring openly at her. He frowned, looking at his ticket out of the corner of his eye as if to check for himself. He crossed his arms, then looked forward as if to signal his annoyance. Behind her, a white woman, her hair frozen and her Hermes scarf around her neck, leaned towards her husband. She must have gotten lost, right? This seat costs more than a month's salary. His tone was condescending, barely a whisper, but enough for Camille to hear. She had heard worse, in other languages, on other continents. She remained unmoved. She didn't even look up from his book. She knew this kind of scene. It was part of the pre-invisibilito pay when you were a black woman in a world that didn't expect you there. But the microaggressions soon turned into official suspicion. A blonde hostess, in his 30s, with impeccable manicures and a fitted uniform, approached lightly. His smile was professional, but his eyes betrayed discomfort. "Hello, madam, may I see your boarding pass, please?" His voice was soft, but not neutral. Camille slowly looked up. She looked into the woman's eyes, silent, then wordlessly held out her note. The flight attendant glanced at it quickly. A moment of hesitation. Her gaze moved from the ticket to the seat number, then to Camille's face, as if searching for the invisible error. She straightened up with a mechanical smile. "Ah, okay. I'll check something." And she walked away in speed, throwing a last glance over her shoulder, as if expecting Camille to disappear from one moment to the next. Camille placed her book back on her lap. She allowed herself a long, almost imperceptible breath. She knew this scenario by heart. And she knew exactly what was coming next. What they didn't know was that she wasn't just a black woman in first class. She was Camille Anderson. And above all, she was the wife of the founder of Monroe Air. 5 minutes later, the chief cabin crew member, a tall man with graying temples named M. Richard Thompson, approached Camille. He was not alone. At his side walked the person responsible for the theft, a certain Mr. Halpern, younger, stiffer, visibly uncomfortable, lips pressed together and eyes shifty. Camille, still immersed in her novel, felt their presence before she even looked up. The atmosphere around her had become electric, heavy, as if her mere right to be there had triggered a silent process of polite hostility. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat, then addressed her with a soft voice, but charged with authority disguised under a layer of courtesy. "Hello, madam, sorry to bother you. We received a remark from some passengers. Apparently, there is a confusion about your place. Could you please confirm that you have booked this seat?" Camille slowly looked up from his book. Her gaze, calm and steady, rested on the eyes of the cabin chief. There was neither anger nor panic in her, just a controlled coldness, a familiar disappointment, the one felt by people we always suspect before listening to them. She closed her book slowly. "You've already seen my post. I'm in 1A. And I'm there." A silence. Mr. Thompson swallowed. He clearly hadn't expected Camille to respond. "Of course, madam. But, for security reasons, we need to do some checks. Nothing personal, obviously." Camille barely raised an eyebrow. Security, the magic word. The one we use when we want to camouflage fear, or racism, under a cloak of procedures. She took a deep breath, without raising her voice. "I paid for my ticket by credit card. First class. Full fare. No upgrade. No miles. If this seems strange, I invite you to call the regional manager of the airline. Or better yet." She paused, and her gaze became more piercing. "Call the owner of Monroe Air." Mr. Thompson blinked in surprise. He exchanged a worried look with Mr. Halpern. "The owner?" he repeated, a little taken aback. "Yes," she said. Her voice was calm, without an ounce of apparent emotion. "Call him." The flight manager cleared his throat, ready to argue, but Camille raised a hand, interrupting without rudeness, like a woman who no longer has time for this kind of charade. She plunged her hand into her bag, calmly took out his phone, and opened a conversation titled Blackheart J. A Blackheart. Sober. Accomplice. Without a photo. But every word she typed vibrated with meaning. She wrote slowly, without hiding. "Guess what? Another in-flight humiliation. Your staff doubts that I'm in the right place. It's your turn." Then, without waiting for an answer, she put the phone back in the inside pocket of her jacket, like sliding a pawn on a chessboard knowing that the opposing king has no escape. She looked at the two men in front of her, still standing there, visibly confused. Her silence was becoming more eloquent than any speech. No one spoke for a few seconds. Then Camille reopened her book and looked down, as if to signal that their presence was no longer required. The two men backed away quietly, whispering to each other, and left first class under the heavy stares of the other passengers. They didn't know it yet, but they had just triggered something they weren't ready to face. 20 minutes later, as the aircraft was slowly taxiing towards the takeoff runway, a subtle but palpable change took place in the atmosphere of the plane. It was no longer just the roar of the turbines that could be heard, but a contained, almost nervous, agitation emanating from the crew. A flight attendant hurriedly whispered something in her colleague's ear. Another walked past the first-class cabin without daring to meet Camille's gaze. The purser, Mr. Thompson, was called forward. A few moments later, it was the captain himself who was seen striding across the aisle to reach the cockpit. One of the stewards, standing by the curtain, was clutching a satellite phone to his ear, pale, his jaw tense. Calls came one after another, internal codes flashed silently, hidden behind fixed smiles. The passengers, however, didn't understand. But Camille, she knew the discreet and silent power that her husband could trigger with a simple message. She didn't even look up from her book. She waited. Quiet. "I see." Then, the cabin chief reappeared. That he was no longer the self-confident, formal, somewhat haughty man of earlier. His face had lost its color, his forehead shone with cold sweat, his hands were shaking slightly, and he stopped in front of Camille like a schoolboy caught in trouble. "Mrs. Anderson. I want to apologize. Our sincerest apologies. There has been a misunderstanding. A regrettable misunderstanding. Your note is perfectly in order, of course. He spoke too quickly, too quietly, as if he wanted his words to disappear as soon as they were spoken. The first-class passengers strained their ears. White couple who filed the complaint had frozen. The woman nervously fiddled with the clasp of her gold bracelet, while her husband stared stubbornly at his shoes, like a child who knows he has caused an incident he can no longer control. Camille, without rushing, slowly closed his book. She crossed her legs and raised her head. His gaze, fixed on Thompson, was of an icy intensity, without the need for anger. Tell me, Mr. Thompson, is this protocol now? To systematically doubt the legitimacy of a black woman in first class? Thompson stammered something inaudible, his eyes shifting. At this precise moment, the blonde hostess from earlier reappeared, followed by a man in an impeccable dark blue suit, wearing a badge adorned with the Monroe Air logo. It was David Klein, Director of Onboard Operations, one of the company's most senior officials on international flights. He bowed slightly to Camille, his face grave, his tone measured. Mrs. Anderson, please accept our most formal apologies. We just received a direct call from your husband. He informed us personally of the incident. A shudder ran through the cabin. The name, Mr. Anderson, in aviation circles, was not that of a mere VIP passenger. Julian Anderson Monroe was the founder, CEO and largest shareholder of Monroe Air, an influential figure in the industry. The fact that he picked up the phone in the middle of the morning to contact the crew of a commercial flight in progress showed how serious the incident was, and how much his wife mattered. Camille remained silent. The silence around her was becoming heavy. All eyes converged on her first-class passengers, bankers, diplomats, CEOs, who had initially watched with amused or condescending distance suddenly realized their mistake. She put her headphones back on, calmly, as if the scene hadn't affected her. Then she said in a calm, almost weary voice, "Your apologies won't change what you thought when you saw me." It was a simple sentence, but it fell like a guillotine in the cabin. She wasn't expecting reparation. She was re-establishing a fact. She wasn't trying to humiliate. She recalled a silent truth: she had been judged before she even opened her mouth. And this evil could not be cured with ready-made formulas. She sank back into her seat, gently pressed the button to recline the backrest, and launched a classical playlist on her phone. Around her, the passengers no longer dared to speak. The guilty couple bowed their heads, silenced. And in the shadows, the fear of having touched someone more powerful than oneself was slowly setting in. But for Camille, it was neither revenge nor victory. It was just another ordinary day, fighting even when she said nothing. Upon arrival at JFK, the late morning sun bathed the tarmac in a golden glow. The plane taxied slowly toward its gate, and the first-class passengers, still groggy from the hours of flight, were slowly waking up. Some were checking their phones. Others were putting their shoes back on or closing their carry-on suitcases. But it was silence first, then the whispers, which gradually invaded the cabin. Through the portholes, a strange device was revealed. Where passengers expected to see a baggage truck and a moving staircase, they discovered 3 black SUVs perfectly aligned, engines running. Near the bridge, several men in dark suits, earpiece to ear, stood straight, hands crossed in front of them. And in the center, a man alone, motionless, straight as a blade, draped in a charcoal gray cashmere scarf. He wore a custom-made Italian wool coat, his face closed, tense, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. The tension in the cabin rose a notch. "Who is he?" whispered a passenger. "Is he here for someone?" whispered another. When the gangplank finally secured itself to the main gate, the crew seemed hesitate for a brief moment, as if they knew that something was going to change. Then the door opened. The man climbed aboard. With a calm but authoritative step, he entered the first class without saying a word to anyone. At that moment, all eyes converged on him. His imposing charisma was obvious that we didn't stop him. We let him pass, that he had the confidence of those who never ask permission. When he took off his glasses, the most attentive recognized his face. Julian Monroe. Founder, CEO and majority shareholder of Monroe Air. A man whose name shook boardrooms and brought political leaders across the country into line. But above all, a man known for being discreet, but formidably determined. And at that precise moment, he wasn't there as a boss. He was there as a husband. He stopped in front of Camille, still sitting. She looked into his eyes, without smiling, without words. He bowed slightly and placed a tender kiss on her forehead. Then he stood up, turned around, and faced the entire crew. His voice was serious, slow, measured, but it carried a sort of condemnation. This morning, my wife, Dr. Camille Anderson Monroe, a Harvard-educated physician, respected humanitarian, and upstanding citizen, was treated like an intruder. Not because she didn't have her ticket. Not because she'd made a mistake. But because some in this cabin refused to imagine that a black woman could, simply, to be in one's place. His gaze swept the cabin, deliberately meeting the gaze of every first-class passenger. The couple responsible for the complaint, seated at the back on the right, curled up in silence, frozen with shame. The woman was now staring at her handbag as if she were trying to disappear inside it. Julian continued, in a harsher tone. This kind of treatment is not a simple breach of protocol. This is a reflection of a biased system. It is the sum of the small prejudices tolerated every day. And I want everyone here to understand one thing: I will not tolerate it anymore. The chief cabin crewman, Mr. Thompson, stood stiffly, her face white as a sheet. The blonde hostess lowered her head, unable to meet the CEO's gaze. Julian calmly nodded at the crew. Starting this week, a mandatory training on racial bias will be deployed in all Monroe Air crews. And those who participated in this scene today will have to answer for it. Personally. A religious silence reigned in the cabin. Then he reached out his hand to Camille, with solemn slowness. She seized it without hesitation, stood up with that cold grace that characterized her. Ensemble, they got off the plane, hand in hand. But the shock was not over. At the bottom of the footbridge, dozens of photographers were waiting. Cameras on, microphones out. Julian had Medito flee one's own arrival. He wanted this moment be seen. May this injustice not die in the silence of airport corridors. Flashes crackled. Cameras filmed. A billionaire CEO. His wife humiliated. And a truth that they had not been able to hide. The incident was made public less than 2 hours after landing, when a first-class passenger, a young entrepreneur named Michael Reed, posted on his X account, formerly Twitter, a video discreetly captured from his seat. We could clearly see the moment Julian Monroe entered the plane, stopped in front of his wife, then addressed the crew firmly. The video quality wasn't perfect, but the message was clear. The video was accompanied by a simple caption. They humiliated her on the plane, without knowing that her husband was the owner of the company. Barely published, the video exploded. First a few thousand views. Then tens of thousands. Then some millions. It was shared by personalities, journalists, civil rights activists, but also ordinary travelers. She was awakening something deep-rooted, this indignation in the face of trivialized injustice, the one that we too often accept without naming it. Everyday racism. Automatic suspicion. Politeness that masks contempt. Hashtags invaded global trends. Hashtag Camille Anderson. Hashtag Vol 747. Hashtag Racism and Altitude. Hashtag Respect Sans Condition. Hashtag Elietatis Aplis. Political columnists, sociology professors, former flight attendants all added their voices. Similar testimonies flocked from all sides, women, Black, Asian, Latino men, recounting identical scenes, unjustified stops, silent suspicions, humiliating questions about their right to be there. In a few hours, the matter went beyond Monroe Air. She became a mirror held up to an entire country. Facing this storm, Camille Anderson Monroe received dozens of interview requests: CNN, NBC, The New Yorker, The World, the BBC. She declined all, except one. She agreed to speak briefly at a public event, the annual ceremony of the Women for Social Justice, where she was initially scheduled to attend as a low-key guest. When she went on stage, dressed simply in a midnight blue dress and a black scarf, silence fell in the room. Cameras were broadcasting live. Hundreds of thousands of people were watching. She only spoke for a few minutes, but each word was weighed, precise, as sharp as it is elegant. What I experienced on that plane isn't new. It's not exceptional. It's not even shocking. It's commonplace. And that's the problem. She paused. There was a cough from the back of the room. Nothing else. When you're black, a woman, or perceived as out of the norm, you learn to never let up. To anticipate the looks. To carry the weight of stereotypes on your shoulders. His gaze swept the room. I wasn't humiliated because I didn't have a ticket. I was humiliated because, in the collective imagination, I couldn't be in my place. Then she concludes with a sentence that went viral in a few seconds. True luxury is not gold or reclining chairs. It's not champagne at 10,000 meters above sea level. True luxury is being treated with respect. It doesn't matter what color your skin is. The applause was long. Slow. Deep. The day after, the New York Times headlined. Camille Anderson Monroe, the woman who forced an industry to face its own biases. And in the following days, Monroe Air publicly announced a complete overhaul of its crew training. Several competing airlines followed. A Netflix documentary was released, First Class, the Respect Award. Camille refused the TV sets, but the impact of his silence and his sober words resonated much more stronger than a heated debate. She had become unintentionally a symbol. Not an activist. Not a star. Buta-worthy woman, who had chosen not to remain silent when she was seen as an intruder.